Our next speaker is Dr. Brian Litt. Dr. Litt is professor of neurology, neurosurgery, and bioengineering at the University of Pennsylvania and director of the University of Pennsylvania Epilepsy Center. He is one of the world's leading authorities on neuroengineering, implantable brain devices, and neurotechnology, particularly for epilepsy. A clinician scientist, inventor, and entrepreneur, Dr. Litt divides his time between directing the Penn Epilepsy Center, Penn Center for Neuroengineering and Therapeutics, Penn Health. Sorry about that. As I was saying, Dr. Litt divides his time between directing the Penn Epilepsy Center, Penn Center for Neuroengineering and Therapeutics, Penn Health Tech, a new university-wide effort to bring new technologies from Penn scientists to patients, and his Philadelphia startup, Blackfin. Dr. Litt has an engineering degree from Harvard, received his MD and training in medicine and neurology from Johns Hopkins. Dr. Litt has received numerous honors and awards and also serves as an advisor to the NIH/NSF/White House Brain Initiative. He has mentored over 50 graduate students and postdoctoral fellows who now serve as leaders in academia, industry, and government worldwide. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Litt as he takes the stage to give his talk entitled Ghost in the Machine, Melding Brain, Computer, and Behavior.
Just a PowerPoint. Yeah. Probably here somewhere, right? This is the one that's on your machine. There's another one. That's the one.
Okay, wait, you have to close out this one first, though. Can you just
close that one?
Oh, no, click here. It's still open on the screen. You have to close this one. Great. Okay. We should be able to go back.
Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. So a couple of teaching points before I get started. If somebody asks you to submit a bio before you give a talk somewhere and you don't do it, then they give you a full introduction like that. The longer the intro, the closer you are to like retirement and death. So I would have preferred like he's a faculty member here. A couple of quick things. I don't direct the Epilepsy Center anymore. Kate Davis does, and Blackfin is bankrupt. So besides that, everything is good. But I am still employed here, and several of my graduate students, a bunch of them are here out of the kindness of their hearts. Usually they sit on the Zoom when I like give my lectures for my class, and they're like, stop, shut up. Don't say that. All right, so we're going to have a little bit of fun, and we're going to start with a story. So a 30-year-old veteran walks into a bar. I always wanted to start a grant with a man walks into a bar. This is the beginning of a grant. None of the patrons are aware of the anti-seizure device implanted in his brain or the traumatic brain injury that requires it. It's been a long day. He quickly downs a cold beer. Within minutes, his iPhone vibrates with a text from his implantable. What are you doing, Dave? Your probability of seizure within the next 12 hours just increased to 64%. 20-ounce beer, he texts back. The device pauses, replies, then resumes. I'll remember that. I suggest you not have another. I'll stimulate for now and text if things worsen. Above 80% probability you should take an Ativan and call an Uber. So how realistic is that? Like, could we actually do that now? Would somebody give you $7.5 million based on that paragraph? They're not as smart as we think, are they? So brain-computer interfaces have captured our imagination in a lot of ways. They've captured our most serious scientific endeavors. I mean, well, actually, so like Homer Simpson isn't our most serious scientific endeavor, but they've captured our imagination in our humor, in our science fiction. I'm not exactly sure why for brain-computer interfaces you need to plug into their lungs, but that might be for the last speaker. And some of the most breathtaking technologies that we have going, including this, and we won't talk too much about this. Well, maybe a little bit. I'm not going to give too much credit to the financial sponsor, but his name rhymes with Pelon Dusk. But so these are important, interesting discoveries, and they've really, over the past 20 years, evolved dramatically since Matt Nagel was the first human implanted with a brain-computer interface to use to control a machine. So these are used for a lot of things, and you've all seen the videos of monkeys moving and feeding themselves marshmallows by controlling robotic arms through implants in their motor cortex. You've seen maybe videos of people with paraplegia driving cars with 2 or 3-dimensional brain-computer interfaces. Makes me a little nervous. That's how they got there to begin with. Sorry, that's really in poor humor, maybe, but it's amazing what things can be accomplished. But I'm partly a clinician and partly an engineer, and my interests are really bringing these things into everyday practice with neuro devices. There are a lot of disorders that we address, and here are some of the most common ones right now where brain-computer interfaces, kind of writ large, devices that interact with the nervous system in open or closed loop using novel strategies, can be used to control. I focus on epilepsy, but you've already heard the last 2 speakers working on other things like spinal cord injury, mental health. How do we get signals out of the brain? Well, a lot of this work started with some of the early work from Penfield and Jasper, maybe in the 60s and 70s, where they put electrodes in the brain in the operating room. But then later implants that come out of the brain are externalized to map where seizures go. We have a really active program here with a 12-bed epilepsy monitoring unit up on the 9th floor in the new hospital. And if you haven't visited it, you should come and visit us. Your IDs won't let you in, but I'm inviting you anyhow. Where we actually have state-of-the-art machines from BlackRock that can record at high bandwidth, process, and stimulate in almost real time. We extract data through electrodes implanted in the brain, and we do quantitative measurements. And our lab focuses on a variety of different areas, but one of them is perhaps mapping surgical epileptic networks to figure out where to operate and intervene. The devices that are used currently in practice right now are relatively crude. They're kind of threshold detectors that work in the moment. So they might pick up a feature exceeds a threshold that says maybe a seizure starting, and it triggers an electrical stimulation in a very patterned. It might be an open loop device that just stimulates deep in the brain, subthalamic nucleus, for example, to improve motor function in Parkinson's disease. They don't really communicate very much with the outside world. They may be able to telemeter data out, but it's limited variably depending upon the model, and there isn't really an ongoing dialogue. They're programmed relatively rarely. These patients may go to see their physician at 3-month intervals to get them uploaded. Not a time scale that's really conducive to real-time improvement or being informed about what's going on in your brain. And they don't learn. Despite that fact, over 3.5 million individuals in the United States have implanted medical devices that do detection, warning, stimulation, other functions. And these are just some of the examples for brain stimulation. You've already seen, examples of thalamic stimulation, cochlear implants, devices for pain, for spinal cord injury, for bladder function, and more recently, functional electrical stimulation for movement, stimulating neurons in the spinal cord or lower motor neurons that help people stand and even ambulate in a relatively crude sort of zombie-like function. But those things are improving as there's longer battery life, better processing power, more intelligent algorithms. Those things are improving, and they're improving at a pretty dramatic rate. So there's an explosion in BCI technology right now. And a lot of it's going on at Penn. There's hardware and materials, cloud computing, intelligence, algorithms, data science, natural language processing in the electronic medical record. And we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. The question is, how far are they going to evolve? And how far are you going to let them evolve? And what kinds of societal decisions are we going to have? So let's talk about some of those. Now, you notice that the speakers have different approaches to things. So poor Desmond is like seeing people who are depressed and anxious, and you could tell that his talk, he conveyed some of that to you. People with young children convey the excitement of having young children. I have people who are kids who are past their teenage years, so I'm going to talk about a dystopian existence. Not completely. So what sorts of technologies are there? Well, here's the question. Avatar was a great explanation of what we need. We need to be able to tap in, record, and be able to stimulate every neuron in the brain. We need to do it through a connector that's in the tail of a blue person. And then we need to transmit it through outer space into Sigourney Weaver's head. That makes sense. We can't quite do that yet, but we can do a lot. So the first thing is that there are new implants that are on dissolving silk that can meld into the surface of the brain and match the mechanical impedance of the brain to transmit over long periods of time. They're high resolution. By the way, the little Penn emblem are things that have been invented at Penn. This one is a single 1 square centimeter electrode with active electronics developed in the CNT that can transmit, record, and in the future and soon be able to stimulate really finely patterned electrical stimulation and zoom in and zoom out. Now, the first experiment by this student, who's now almost a tenured professor at Duke, called me in the middle of the night and said, I just wanted to let you know everything's okay. And I was like, what do you mean everything's okay? And he said, the fire only lasted a really short time. So it's just one of those great PI calls from a graduate student, because when you have active electronics on a sealed device and it generates heat and the lamination comes off and it hydrolyzes water into oxygen and hydrogen with a little bit of heat, that doesn't go so well. But these have improved a lot. Neural dust. These are piezoelectric devices that are activated by ultrasound that can turn that energy into electrical stimulation non-invasively or read out electrical activity. Science fiction? No, the company's called IOTA, and it's out of Berkeley and UCSF. Dissolving electronics, developed here, Flavia Vitale, our lab, and John Rogers at Northwestern. Optogenetic stimulation in fibers, which can go down to the submillimeter level. Electronics from Flavia Vitale that can be steered once they're in the brain and penetrate with 10 micron fibers using the same technology that mosquitoes use to inject electrodes in you, or actually not electrodes, but to be able to eat. Injectable electronic meshes from Harvard. And then, of course, these devices from Neuralink, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those. So the hardware is evolving rapidly. And finally, Casey Cullen's work with growing neuronal constructs that can be implanted and controlled with optogenetics so that you're actually building new devices that will grow into the brain. Sounds sort of like one of those science fiction movies that doesn't end well, doesn't it? So far, Casey's doing fine, and his company just received $40 million in startup funding for that technology. All right, so what about the Neuralink device? What does it do? 20 micron fibers, multiple contacts on each wire, threaded with the brain sewing machine. Have you guys seen this? How many of you have seen these videos? How many of you saw their broadcast like 3 days ago on TV? It's like terrible when the person who provides the money presents the science, because you sit there and you're like, no, that's not what it does. But take a look. So it shines light. Actually, is the video going to work here? Shines light, figures out where the blood vessels are so it can avoid them, injects the electrode, comes back and moves to inject the next one. And their yield for single units off of these fibers is tremendous. They have wireless rechargeable. Right now, it's estimated about once per day they can transmit out data at very high rates and hundreds of channels at a time. And by the way, one of the founders of this company, Neuralink, is Paul Marollo, who was a PhD student of bioengineering. So that's pretty cool. But not every device that's being used right now is a Neuralink device. They're looking to get FDA approval for their first human implants. Now, they've changed a lot because they were going to augment people, to expand your thinking with all of the potential ethical conflicts involved in having a superior class, mostly rich people, who can be augmented while the rest of us kind of slog around in the laboratory. But there are a lot of devices that are really moving forward pretty fast. So monitoring electrode devices that are wireless, that transmit out from under the skin and the scalp, and there are a variety of companies doing that. There's the NeuroPace device, which is closed loop, which records, monitors EEG, and stimulates to shut off seizures. These are being linked to wearables, devices to predict events like seizures from NeuroVista, Bluetooth devices to monitor all sorts of biological signals, and they're now being linked to implantable devices. So not only do you look for a seizure pattern that looks like it's going on in the EEG, but to distinguish that, you can look and see if there are movements that are characteristic of that seizure. You can titrate stimulation in implantable brain devices for movement disorders, and you might give different stimulation patterns with steerable electrodes like the ones from Boston Scientific, which can steer the field to different areas. And you might say to your device, you know, I'm going for a walk, improve my walking, and I don't care about it. But you might say a different thing and have a setting and say, I'm going to sit down and write a letter to my children. So I don't care about my walking, but improve my tremor and don't let me worry about it. And these things are possible now through research here and in places like UCSF, where Phil Starr is working. Probably one of the most important developments is our group and others are taking data out of these devices and putting them up to the cloud. So this is work in collaboration with the Mayo Clinic, and Brittany Scheid worked on this from our lab, where we have RC+S devices that can transmit data out in dogs, where we're taking those data out of the dogs and up to the cloud. We're working on algorithms that can classify these events and learn and say, you know what, those are seizures and the device isn't detecting those. Change the algorithms and put them back into the dogs without them ever coming into our office. Those devices are now implanted in patients at Mayo. We hope to be doing some here. And if you can imagine, it's not much more of a stretch to have your device retuned every time you walked into a Starbucks, rather than having to go to the doctors at 3-month intervals. Now, you know, if the stimulation setting doesn't work right, it might interfere with your coffee a little bit, but it's certainly a work in progress. There's a lot of interest in these data as well, and just our shared archive, open source, IEG.org, now has 5,700 people who are using the data worldwide in this map. So pretty interesting. There's also a lot of work going on in this cloud computing for devices and sharing and aggregating data. And so Joost Wagenaar was a postdoc in the lab, and he's now an assistant professor in the IBI, collaborates with Zach Ives, chair of computer science, and a number of other faculty here taking data up to the cloud. We hope to make this a place where data will reside, and eventually utilities like this will be where your data will go, out of your device, up to the cloud to be retrained. And then the other issue is, why shouldn't everybody who has a device learn from everybody else who has a device? Why shouldn't the measures of your stimulation and your response for tremor or obsessive compulsive disorder or dystonia be compared against every other patient who's gone before and say, you know what, you're like these 200 people, and this is what worked in them, and that's where we're going to start it. And that's becoming possible. There are privacy issues, but people are dealing with it. So here's an example in 3 cases of output from a NeuroPace device up on Pensive that shows seizures that are detected. And it's not much of a stretch to say, if the patient can be informed what behaviors cause seizures, like stress or drinking, none of that, or staying up late, that not only can the device work better to treat those events, but informing the patient of what they're doing and how it affects their health. It's like a pretty amazing development. And I think this is becoming quite real. And a number of folks are working on this. And this is just an example. Every one of these horizontal lines is a day, a 24-hour period. This is output from a device we worked on to predict seizures before they occur. Blue means that it's predicted that you're going to be seizure-free for at least the next hour. Red means a seizure is likely. The lightning bolts means a seizure happened. Gray means there was a data dropout. And white means the device couldn't tell. This was the best patient out of the 15 in Australia that we worked on. But you can see that every seizure was predicted in advance. There were 3 or 4 false alarms in a month where the patient could take medicine to try to prevent the seizures. And what the patient said that they got the most benefit from was the blue. Because when they saw blue light on their device, it told them that they had an hour where they could be pretty sure they'd be safe to go to the store or go out to the theater or have dinner or something like that. This is today. This isn't like science fiction. This just gives you an idea. This is an output sent up to the cloud of measures in a patient with a NeuroPace device that we have over a 3-year period. And those are the kinds of data that we can extract to get features to compute on. There are problems. It's not continuous data. You know, Brittany used to have a lot more hair before she started pulling a lot of it out for this. But really interesting and capabilities to do tons. What about the medical record? Suppose your device, which has algorithms in the cloud, can get to your medical record. So this is work that Kevin Shea and some other folks are doing in the lab with Colin Ellis and Dan Roth in computer science, Collins in neurology. This is 12 years of data extracted initially from the records of 9,500 patients. There are only 5,000 that are displayed here. This is 12 years. A yellow dot says the patient was seizure-free, had a seizure since the last visit. Horizontal lines are individuals. Blue means they were seizure-free. Well, wait a minute. The device can look and see, did this patient take their medicine regularly? Maybe that's why they had a seizure. Is there something else that's going on? Did they show up for their appointments? Maybe they might suggest changes in stimulation or changes in therapy. But then, wait a minute, there are kind of privacy issues there too. But it's not hard for these algorithms to get access. Believe me, if Kevin can get access to your data, the algorithms can, and so can the insurance. So this is one of the things we're working on, and it's a work in progress, and it's a difficult problem because we don't have great implantables that can transmit data out in real time. But the idea is that we have patients with implants. Right now we're using patients implanted in the epilepsy monitoring unit with electrodes in place. Data's coming out and it's giving off predictions of probability of seizure, characterizing the seizure. A chatbot is something we're working on to interact with the patient through regular surveys, but also so the patient can freely talk with the chatbot and say, I feel like I'm going to have a seizure. Or the device can pick up something that's going on in the EEG and say, what are you doing? Your probability is changing. And then develop this system where the devices can actually speak and communicate with the patients. Kind of interesting, you know, there's voice printing now where you can record your voice and have a computer synthesize speech in your own voice, or remember a parent's voice or something else. This device could actually communicate with you through the voice of your favorite teacher, your most feared superhero. I mean, it becomes kind of a weird thing to think about how your life might interact. And even with these simple surveys, some of the patients in the hospital were communicating with them like they were listening to them, like more than the nurses. So it could become kind of a weird part of your being. I don't know if you've seen this, but ChatGPT, this is one that just came out recently where this chat strategy from one of the AI companies was asked to write a biblical verse in the language of the King James Bible explaining how to remove a peanut butter sandwich from a VCR. And it did a really good job. And if you haven't seen it, I mean, it ends with, and the man heeded the Lord's words, and from that day forth he kept his sandwich in their proper place, and he was saved from trouble and woe. Amen. But if you have to live with this this chatbot, maybe it would take on kind of a personality for you. And you guys have probably all read about this poor scientist who spent so many hours with this thing. He thought it was sentient, and that's a little scary. So near the end, this is what my clinic looks like in 2035. 8 a.m., computer referral, predicted new onset seizure patient, forecasted seizure risk of greater than 85%, a perfectly healthy person. Should we implant a device in that because the computer accessed their medical records and said, you're going to develop epilepsy? That's scary. 9 a.m., medication-resistant college student. The implant shows poor compliance. She wasn't taking her meds. Drinking. The insurer is threatening to cut off their insurance. How stupid does that sound? Not very. 9:30, refractory patient for pre-surgical discussion. The computer optimized stimulation through the cloud hasn't worked. They're going to go for robotic ablation. 10:15, follow-up for regenerated graft to treat traumatic brain injury. Imaging cognitive map, similar to what you heard before from Desmond, shows improvement. We're going to adjust the stimulation and growth patterns. Then 11, wealthy patient's son is failing 8th grade. Parents want augmentation. They will pay out of pocket. Should I approve it? That's where we're headed. So these are decisions that you all are going to have to make. How much should we invest in this? What about the scientific payload? Should the data from every person's implantable device go up to the cloud and be available for everybody else? These algorithms and devices can learn and treat at scale, but what about freedom? Do you really want these devices? I can tell you can tell when you're drinking. Do you really want everybody else to know? Like what you're doing when? It's not so unrealistic. Is augmentation ethical? I don't know. Remember that guy Elon Musk? Would you trust him? Are those implants going to come preloaded with Twitter and Truth Social? Could be. We're going to have to decide these things. It's not science fiction. And I put up actually a reference to Anna Wexler, who we're going to have come and give some talk sometime. If you don't know her, she's a neurotechnology ethicist, which is, how cool is that? I don't want her looking at my stuff. No, that's not true. So this is the CNT, and you know, truth can be a little stranger than fiction. And I think we're headed here, and it's a very exciting time. So thanks so much.